Well, we've been covering the UN General Assembly sessions for a while now, and I can tell you this, the 75th UNGA session will go down in history as the most unconventional one. It's a victim of the times we're living in. The Wuhan virus has turned this grand gathering into a glorified Zoom meeting. There are no discussions taking place this time, no face-to-face meetings, just a week-long procession of recorded messages from world leaders, leaders who only seem to be targeting their domestic audience through their speeches. At least 8 major world leaders have already spoken at the virtual stage at the UN. All of them shared their vision, crafted mostly with domestic issues in mind. We've already discussed Donald Trump and Xi Jinping on this show. Let's talk about some others. I'll start with the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. He touched upon an array of issues. What stood out was Putin's proposal for an international treaty to prohibit weapons in space. He also offered to share all information regarding the Sputnik 5 vaccine with interested countries.
Russia is putting forward an initiative to sign a binding agreement between all the leading space powers that would provide for the prohibition of the placement of weapons in outer space and the threat or use of force against objects in outer space. Building on the scientific, industrial and clinical experience of its doctors, Russia has promptly developed a range of test systems and medicines to detect and treat the coronavirus, as well as registered the world's first vaccine, Sputnik 5. I would like to reiterate that we are completely open to partner relations and willing to cooperate. In this context, we are proposing to hold an online high-level conference shortly for countries interested in cooperation in the development of anti-coronavirus vaccines.
Next on the list, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron. His speech included veiled attacks on the US and China. Macron urged world leaders to not let the geopolitical power struggle between these two countries dominate global discourse. He called upon them to build a new world order. Listen to this.
Sur la Corée du Nord,
Today's world cannot be left to the rivalry between China and the United States, regardless of the weight in the world that these two great powers share, regardless of the history that ties us, especially to the United States, the crisis, the collapse of our frameworks of cooperation, the fragility I have just referenced. All of that means that we must build a new order, and it means that Europe needs to fully shoulder its responsibility.
Speaking of Iran, the Iranian president addressed the General Assembly earlier today, and surprisingly, he chose to speak about racial tensions in America. Of all the things in the world, Rouhani used the killing of George Floyd as a metaphor for America's treatment of Iran. He said the kneeling on the neck of George Floyd was symbolic of America's knee of arrogance on the neck of independent nations. His speechwriter has the gift of imagery, I have to say. Listen to this.
The footage broadcast to the world concerning the treatment of an African American by the US police is reminiscent of our own experience. We instantly recognize the feet kneeling on the neck as the feet of arrogance on the neck of independent nations. For decades, the valiant Iranian nation has paid a similar high price for its quest for freedom and liberation from domination and despotism. However, the Iranian nation has not only resisted the pressure, but flourished and advanced while persistently pursuing its historical and civilizational role as the axis of peace and stability, the harbinger of dialogue, tolerance, and the champion of the fight against occupation and extremism.
Then we come to the president of Turkey. He refrained from talking about the United States, but he had a lot to say about India on Kashmir, and we're not surprised one bit. President Erdogan never leaves an opportunity to question India's secular credentials at global platforms. He said Kashmir is still an issue that should be resolved within the framework of United Nations resolutions. India slams the Turkish president every time he says something like this by issuing statements, and this time was no different. I'll not go into the statements, but Erdogan also made scathing remarks about the United Nations itself. Watch this.
We have to evaluate the picture in front of us by looking at the empty and full sides of the glass. At the empty side of the glass, UN being chief among them, many of the multilateral organizations are in need of reforms. We have seen how ineffective global mechanisms were in this current global crisis. The UN's most essential decision-making organization, the Security Council, took months to even bring up the outbreak to their agendas. At the beginning of the pandemic, a scene emerged where countries were left on their own.
We also saw a debut at the 17th UNGA. Saudi Arabia's King Salman addressed the global body for the first time, and he expressed his support for American efforts to establish peace between Israel and Palestine. That's a grand hint. Take a look.
We support the efforts of the current US administration to bring about peace in the Middle East by bringing both the Palestinians and the Israelis together at the negotiating table to reach a fair and comprehensive agreement.
And last but not the least, the Trump of the tropics also addressed the UNGA session. I'm talking about Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil. He only vented about the state of affairs in his country. He blamed the Amazon fires on Brazil's indigenous communities. He blamed the Brazilian media for politicizing the virus. He blamed Brazil's opposition for spreading disinformation. And he called upon the international community to combat what he calls rising Christophobia.
I'm calling on the entire international community to protect religious freedom and to fight against Christophobia.